First, we want to talk about the digestive pathway. So this is just a quick overview, and I'll go in depth into each of these steps. So each part of the digestive system has a role in digestion and absorption of nutrients. While not exclusively part of the digestive system, other organs actually are also part of the digestive system, including liver, pancreas, and gallbladder, because they also have roles in digestion. And the main digestive system would be the esophagus, the stomach, as I mentioned, the gallbladder, the small intestine, the large intestine, and then obviously the anus. So this is just the general, I would say, kind of pathway that it goes down, but we'll cover each step in more detail. So firstly, we have the mouth and the esophagus. So this is the first part of the pathway. The mouth is obviously responsible for mechanical breakdown of food with your teeth and just chewing, along with chemical digestion with saliva. Saliva contains the enzymes lipase, amylase, which break down complex fats and starches into more simpler lipids and sugars, respectively. Again, lipase is for fats into more simple lipids, and amylase is for starches into more simple sugars like glucose. And what we call this is, so the chewing part we call mechanical breakdown. This breakdown with enzymes like lipase and amylase, we call that chemical digestion or chemical breakdown, because we're essentially changing like the chemical structure of these molecules that we're breaking down. We're changing the chemical structure of the lipase, of the fats and starches using lipase and amylase into different chemicals that are easier for us, for our bodies to absorb and use. So, so digestion begins directly in the mouth. After the mouth, we go down into the esophagus. The esophagus is crucial because that is where chemical breakdown continues using the saliva. And it's also a way of mechanically transporting the food into the stomach and the rest of the GI tract. The food during the esophagus is packed into a bola, which you don't really have to know this, but it just looks like kind of like a log like this. So the food gets kind of compacted into like this type of shape, just like a log, I guess. Right, and that way it can travel very easily down the esophagus, which if you can see here is a very, I guess, more narrow pipe. So it needs to be more compact if it wants to travel down that way. So the first destination after the esophagus, which you can see ends right here, would be the stomach. And this is usually what we think of when we think of digestive system and just food in general. We just think it goes straight into our stomach. So the stomach is the first first major site of digestion. I mentioned that digestion begins in the mouth and the esophagus, but the stomach is really the first main site. This is where some of the digestive enzymes reside, including pepsins, which are involved in the breakdown of proteins into small peptides to be recycled into the body. Right? We can mix our own polypeptides and amino acids in our own body, but there are some amino acids, and it obviously is also more efficient to reuse them and get them from somewhere else. And the way we get them is from food. When you eat meat or any kind of food, really, it has proteins, and we want to use those proteins, but proteins tend to be very long, very complex, very big, and very difficult for us to use in their current form. However, we can break them down into smaller pieces and have small, short polypeptides and amino acids, and those we can utilize directly and recycle in our body. The way we do that is through these enzymes called pepsins, which, just like the amylase and the lipase, are specifically made for breaking down proteins. This is just one type of protein that's enzyme that's found in the stomach. There's also lipase, amylases, and other types of digestive enzymes. Most of these enzymes are called zymogens, and they're made in the pancreas away from the stomach. So these zymogens are made in an inactive state that cannot digest anything. The inactive state of pepsin, for example, is called pepsinogen. Once they are transported into the stomach from the pancreas, then they become active and can begin digestion. The reason for that is obviously the pepsin, which we're using as an example, it breaks down proteins. Well, if it was active as soon as it was made, it would just break down the proteins that made it, right? It would just break down any nearby proteins it sees, including the ones that are part of your own body. To avoid this, you make them in an inactive state in the pancreas, then you transport them in an inactive state where it's basically dormant, can't do anything. Then you transport it into the stomach, and then in the stomach where you actually want it to be, and to actually where you want it to start digesting stuff, that's when it'll be activated. So another function of the stomach is to produce acid, which is crucial for digestion. There are parietal cells in the stomach, and these are the specific cells that produce this acid. And they're found just on the lining of the stomach. So the stomach acid is extremely important for digestion. So the pH of the stomach is specifically kept very low and very acidic through the presence of HCl or hydrochloric acid. The pH of the stomach is about 2 to 3. And this is because the digestive enzymes like the pepsin, which I mentioned, function best at a low pH. So this is actually one of the ways that we change from the inactive to active state. The rest of your body, the pH is always about 7.4-ish. So the enzyme pepsin at 7.4 won't really function because that's not its ideal environment. And because of that, it'll remain inactive. However, once it reaches the stomach where you actually want it to be and you want to activate it, the way you would activate it is just it senses the acidity in the environment and it becomes active and it functions best in that pH. So at higher pHs, they're essentially non-functional, like in the pancreas where they're made. This mechanism, like I mentioned, prevents pepsin from digesting the proteins in your own body. Oh, this actually, not sure why this is here. Sorry, this is a typo. So the stomach has an internal lining of mucus and bicarbonate, which protects the cells of the stomach from being damaged by the acid. If you see this bicarbonate, this is actually a base. So the acidic version of bicarbonate would be carbonic acid, H2CO3, right? This bicarbonate this carbonic acid is the acidic form. This bicarbonate is the basic form. Bases, as you know, neutralize acids. So the lining of the stomach has this mucus and this bicarbonate, which protect the cells of the stomach from being damaged by the acid. Obviously, the stomach walls are made of cells. Cells are not naturally resistant to acid. So the way you prevent them from just being burned and like kind of destroyed by the acid is you have to have some kind of protection. And this comes in the form of mucus and bicarbonate. The mucus acts as a physical barrier. If you know what mucus is, it physically stops the acid from reaching the cells, right? Because it's a viscous liquid. So it prevents it from actually making contact and dissolving it. And the mucus also is mixed in with bicarbonate, which helps act as a chemical barrier, because as soon as the hydrochloric acid makes contact with the mucus bicarbonate mixture, it'll become neutralized and essentially non-acidic anymore and not damaging, right? So you have a base and the mucus, which acts both mechanically and chemically to prevent damage to your lining of your stomach. If you guys know about acid reflux, so where you can have, it's also called heartburn sometimes. So it's not a buffer in the sense of chemistry buffer. It's a buffer in like the real world sense, where it's like it buffers something. So or it acts like a barrier. In that case, the buffer. In the chemical sense, it's not a buffer, because buffers are really there to resist changes in pH, whereas this is meant to really neutralize instead. So it's a little bit different. Yes, it's not exactly a buffer. So somebody asked in the chat, not in the chemical sense at least. But like I mentioned, there's acid reflux, or sometimes called heartburn, because it feels like it's in your chest. So this all is protected right, by these cells that I mentioned in this mucus. However, and you imagine this is all filled up with the acid, sometimes with people, they have the acid come up, and called the esophageal reflux, can come up into this esophagus. The esophagus is obviously not protected by this mucus and this bicarbonate. And so the cells over here in the esophagus begin to become dissolved by the acid. And that's why you feel like the chest pain or just the pain if you have acid reflux or heartburn. And this is, like I mentioned, it's a typo, but what I did want to mention is that the acid also acts to kind of destabilize any protein. So proteins obviously have 3D structure. They sometimes have function when usually when you cook something, like if you are making meat, when you cook it, it'll denature the proteins, obviously, which will render them non-functional and unwind them. But if you're eating something that's raw that has proteins, the acid also acts to denature them through chemical means, and that's what was supposed to be written here. And I'll make sure when the PowerPoint goes up, I just want to mention it. It's not extremely important, but just for you guys to know. So the next step after the stomach, and you guys can see here, so it came from the stomach. Now it's this really, really long tube-like thing called the small intestine. So the small intestine is the main site of digestion. The stomach was kind of the beginning, and it was the first main part of digestion, but the small intestine is where the vast majority of digestion occurs. It has a huge surface area due to its just many layers of folding. So you can see, firstly, it's really, really long, and it's folded on itself like this way, right? Which gives it a lot of area, and it's a very long like tract. But if you look at this close up right here on the actual like tubing, it has these small little finger-like things called the villi, and this is a even more zoom in of that. So these little villi. What this means is that the actual tubing is not just smooth, right? It's not like a smooth tubing. The actual tubing itself is made of these little like ridges and like finger-like appendages, and that adds just a lot of surface area to it. So I think I remember in undergraduate when I learned this for the first time, my professor mentioned that if you took a small intestine and you like opened it out completely, removed any folding, removed all of like the villi completely stretched out, it would be like the size inside your body would be like the size of a football field or something like that. So that just goes to show how much actual area is inside of your small intestine. And if you guys remember from chemistry, higher surface area means more space to kind of react and go and kind of reabsorb through diffusion, for diffusion to occur, for the reabsorption of nutrients. It also means a lot of area for these enzymes to kind of work with. So the huge surface area of the small intestine allows maximum digestion with enzymes, and for very good reabsorption of the broken down nutrients into the surrounding bloodstream, to surrounding capillaries. So that was just the main thing about the small intestine. That's like the main point of digestion. That's where the vast majority of digestion will occur. So the breakdown with chemicals, like the enzymes, and the absorption into your actual body. The next area that we want to talk about is the large intestine, also called the colon. This one's not really as heavily tested. It's not as important. The role of the large intestine is really to complete reabsorption of any water and nutrients left. So after the small intestine, most of it will have been absorbed into the body, but not all of it. The colon is just there to finish reabsorption. And once you're done with the colon, that's essentially the last step. And because of that, ideally you want to have all of the water and all of the nutrients that were in the food be absorbed, and the only thing you're essentially left with is waste in the form of feces, which will be excreted through the anus. So the colon is kind of like the final, I guess, checkpoint where you just want to make sure that everything you can get that's useful from the food can be taken from the food. And then after this, it's sent to the anus for excretion. We're not really going to talk too much about that because it's not very important. Something that I did mention a little bit is the gallbladder and the liver as being part of the digestive system, and I wanted to cover how that is. So there's this substance called bile. So bile is produced in the liver and it's stored in the gallbladder. This is one of the main actual functions of the gallbladder. It's secreted from the gallbladder into the stomach during digestion of fats, right? So like I mentioned, lipases are very good for chemically breaking down fats. However, some fats are too big to even be broken down with lipases. So what you need is you need this bile to emulsify the fats or kind of mechanically or physically break them down into smaller pieces. And then the lipases can chemically break them down into simpler fats, right? So this doesn't actually make the fats more simple, it just makes them smaller into smaller chunks. Whereas lipases actually make them simpler fats chemically, right? Like I mentioned, emulsifies fats by breaking large chunks into smaller fatty acids, which are easier to digest through lipases. So the majority of people picked answer choice C, with a couple people picking A. So correct answer is actually B. So, and I kind of expected this because this is a little bit of, I guess, a tricky question. So think about what are the products of the liver and what are the products of the pancreas. So that's the first step. Does anybody want to put in the chat what the products of the liver are? I just mentioned it recently, but if you guys want to, anybody wants to put in the chat what the products of the liver that participate in digestion are. Right, bile. Even though it's stored in the gallbladder, technically it's made in the liver, so it's a product of the liver. And what are the products of the pancreas? So this has a couple of different names, I guess. So it's not fatty acids. Fatty acids are what the fats are broken down into. Yeah, lipase, or more generally, it's zymogens, but lipase is one of them. Yeah. So lipase is one of the enzymes that gets produced in the pancreas. So it does, you may think that bile breaks down fats, emulsifies fats and breaks them down into fatty acids, smaller fatty acids, and lipase breaks them down into simpler fats that we can use, right? Well, like I mentioned, bile, when it emulsifies fats, it doesn't actually chemically change the fats. It just physically breaks them apart. So like if you had, say, a sandwich, and then you took a knife and you cut it in half, you made a smaller sandwich, but it's still the exact same thing. It's still the same bread, the same meat, same everything. Everything's still the same. You just made it smaller. You didn't chemically change it. You physically just made it smaller. That's sort of what bile does, right? So it's not actually chemically changing it, it's physically changing it. Whereas lipase, if you took that sandwich and you threw it in some acid, and then that sandwich is no longer a sandwich, something completely different. It's chemically completely different now, right? So that's kind of why it's mechanical and chemical. So this would be, the bile would be mechanical, the pancreas, the lipase would be chemical. So please take a little bit of time to answer this question. The poll should be up. So the results are fairly mixed, with D having a slight lead. However, the correct answer is C, and I'll go over it. Right. So if patient has a condition which causes an increased amount of fat in the feces, which organ is least likely to be affected? So whenever you see a question like this, the first thing you want to think of is, what is this question actually asking? So if the patient has a condition which causes an increased amount of fat in the feces, that means the fat is not being absorbed into the body, right? And there's a number of ways that this could happen. And actually, 3 of these organs will present 3 different ways that this could happen. And one of these will really not be involved. So what you're really looking for is which organ is not involved in digesting and absorbing fats. Well, we just mentioned the liver makes the bile. Bile is needed to emulsify fats to make them easier to break down with lipase. So liver is very important for breaking down fat. So it can't be A. It can't be D, because D, actually, the pancreas is what makes the enzymes that break down the fat, the lipases. So if you don't have the lipase, you can't digest the fat chemically. So it's between B and C. So what are the functions of the small intestine and stomach in relation to fat? Both of them are sites of digestion. And the small intestine specifically is the site of majorly the site of digestion and reabsorption, right? The stomach doesn't have any reabsorption. That's all in the small intestine and then the colon, right? Because you really do need the small intestine, because that's where most of the fat will be digested, and that's where most of the fat will be reabsorbed into the body. So if there's an issue with your small intestine, that means that you're either not digesting the fat or you're not reabsorbing it into the body after it's been digested. However, the stomach is involved in some digestion of fat, but very little, not as much as the small intestine. The stomach is mostly there to produce acid and just begin the digestion process, denature any proteins and anything like that, right? So out of these 4 options, the stomach is the one that's least involved in digestion and reabsorption of fats into the body. So that's why it would be the correct answer.